In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to move and select our various objects within Softimage. Okay, so if you'd like to follow along with me, you can actually open up the file called Lesson 07 Start that has the actual scene file that we're going to be using here. So we're going to be looking at how we can start to move and select our objects within Softimage. So selecting is, again, really a pretty straightforward process, just a matter of clicking on the object that we want to have active. Now the process of selecting becomes a little bit more tricky whenever we start to introduce some of these transformation tools. So for now, let's start to talk about some of these different options for scale, rotate, and translate. So let's start with the scale. So we have our object selected. If we want to scale an object, just simply click on this S button right up here, and you can see now that brings up our scale manipulator. Now when it comes to actually scaling an object, we can come in and either grab either one of these manipulator handles, and you can see as we start to scale that out, it starts to either flatten or extend our object. We can do that in any of these three axes that we want. If we want to move this object or scale it in all three axes, just grab this manipulator right in the middle, and you can see we can actually just grow or shrink this entire object. Now, in addition to moving on a single axis or all three axes, we can actually move in any two axes that we want. So let's say maybe we wanted this object to be scaled in the Z and the X axis, but not be scaled in the Y. Well, if I put my cursor right between these two manipulator handles, you can see that this little yellow box in here starts to kind of lay flat. So now if I click and drag, you can see that it's scaling in two of these manipulators, but the Y-axis is left alone. And I could again just really do this in any two axes that I want. Okay, now below this we have our rotate tool. So if I click on this little R button in here, we can actually start to grab these different rings and start to actually essentially just rotate this object around any of these three axes. Finally, we have our translate tool, which as we start to click on this, again, we can come in, move this along any one axis. We could move this along any three axes by grabbing it right in the middle, or we could grab it and move it in any two axes that we want. Okay, now in addition to being able to come in and just simply grab an object and move it around, we can also come in and type a specific coordinate value in here. So let's say maybe we want this object to no longer be translated. Let's say we want to get this right back to 0. We can come in and just simply type that in, and there we go. Same thing if we wanted our rotation values to be zeroed back out again. We just type in 0, 0, and 0, and there we are, no more rotation. Now, the keyboard shortcuts for jumping back and forth between the scale, rotate, and translate is X for scale, C for translate, or rather C for rotate, and V for translate. Okay, so X, C, and V. Now I'll be using these quite frequently from this point on because this is just a much faster way of jumping back and forth between these tools. Now within Softimage, whenever it comes time to actually, let's say, select a different object, if I had my translate tool active, watch what happens if I actually try to come in here and select this red cylinder. Right? If I simply click and drag, it's actually still moving this original object that I had selected. So within Softimage, we have to be very sure that we are actually pressing and holding the space bar to select a different object. So the space bar is essentially our select tool. Now if I press and hold the space bar, you can see I can now come in and make my selection, and as soon as I let off my space bar, we come right back to whichever of these three transform tools we had active. So again, as long as I have any of these tools active, press and hold the space bar, make my selection, and then let off again. Now if you don't like this particular function, we could actually customize that. We'll learn how we can customize some of these features when we get into our next lesson. But for now, what I want to talk about is, in addition to having to press and hold the space bar, this actually introduces the topic of sticky keys within Softimage. So within Softimage, a keyboard shortcut can have a different effect depending on whether or not it is actually pressed and held or just quickly tapped. So for example, if I were to press and hold my keyboard and then make my selection, as soon as I let off, it takes me right back to whatever tool I had active before. Now, if I quickly tap my spacebar, you can see it leaves me in my selection mode. Okay, now we have the same exact functionality with pretty much any of our keyboard shortcuts. So if I were to press and hold the S key on my keyboard to orbit around, you can see that I'm moving around, and as soon as I let off my S key, you can see we're right back to a select. However, if I quickly tap the S key on my keyboard, you can see I can still come in and move around. Now at the moment, I actually don't have my hand on the keyboard at all. Now, to get back out of this, again, just press and hold or quickly tap a keyboard shortcut for something else. So to get out of this mode, I can just quickly tap the space bar, and there we go. And this also works for things like our different transform tools as well. So if I quickly tap the V key on my keyboard to go to my translate tool, now if I were to press and hold the C key on my keyboard, I can come in and rotate this object. Now as soon as I let off the C key, it takes me right back to whatever tool I had active before, which in this case was my translate tool. Now, again, if I were to press and hold the X key on my keyboard, I can temporarily scale this out, and as soon as I let off my X key, it takes me right back to whatever tool I had before. However, if I quickly tap the X key on my keyboard, you can see it leaves me permanently in this scale mode until I actually were to come in and maybe tap the V key again to go back to my translate. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is the fact that we can actually snap our different transform tools. So if I were to, again, press the C key on my keyboard to jump to my rotate tool, you can see if I were to grab either one of these rotation rings and move it around, that our object moves pretty freely. However, if I press and hold the Shift key on my keyboard and then click and drag, you can see that it actually snaps this object to certain rotational increments. So we can actually come in and snap that. If we actually wanted this to maybe be a perfect 90 degrees, we could either type that in, or we could just simply press and hold the Shift key on our keyboard to rotate that around until we had that perfect 90-degree rotation. And again, whenever I'm done working, just quickly tap my spacebar, and now I'm back in a select mode. Okay, so that's a very basic look at how we can start to grab our objects, move them around, and start to select back and forth between multiple objects. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at some more advanced features of these transform tools.